What up guys, OtterPop here. I am back with another forensic analysis video. I promise I'll be putting together my own content in time, like my own original material and like forensic or science type lessons. It will take me a little bit of preparation, especially with all the other projects I got going on. Don't worry, those kinds of things are coming. However, I recently reacted and analyzed a video by I believe he's a Swedish YouTuber named LEMMiNO. I think I'm pronouncing that right. I could be pronouncing that completely wrong. It was about the Dyatlov Pass Case mystery, and he had a lot of really good stuff in that video. I think it was from like 4 or 5 years ago, so some of the information he later said in the last year, give or take, was a little bit outdated, but I still found it very interesting and valuable information. And as soon as I reacted to that, a lot of people over time were telling me to also watch another one of his videos, The Search for D.B. Cooper. And initially I had a couple of other, like, you know, reaction analysis videos that I was planning, but the more and more people suggested this, the more and more interested that I got, because again, a lot of people were suggesting it. A lot of people. I probably got a few dozen responses. That doesn't seem like a lot, but I am a smaller channel, smaller content creator. So those were some pretty significant numbers, especially given that it was my forensic content, which isn't really watched as much compared to some of my other stuff. I'm hoping to change that. So funny enough, I do know a little bit about the D.B. Cooper hijacking. Basically, the story goes is that there was this guy who was in a plane and he was sort of bargaining for and threatened airplane staff that, you know, he had a bomb and such, and that he wanted his demands met while the plane was in the air. And once he had those, he was like, alright, I'm gonna parachute off. And I think he parachuted somewhere in like one of the mountain ranges on the west coast of the Americas and just disappeared without a trace. Nobody to this day, I think, nobody knows who this guy was. But funny enough, the only reason I really know about it is from a TV show called Leverage, which is... it's still one of my favorite shows to this very day. I still have yet to watch Leverage Redemption? Is that what it's called again? I think. It's like a sort of sequel series. The hijacking of D.B. Cooper was actually the focus of one of the episodes, and I don't remember for sure if I did a little bit of research afterwards, but it was still very interesting to know about this kind of stuff. And then, you know, all of a sudden, everybody's telling me, oh, you have to watch this video too, The Search for D.B. Cooper by LEMMiNO. You have to watch this one. So I'm gonna watch it. I'm not sure how much analysis I'll be able to provide, because I knew a lot more about the Dyatlov Pass mystery than I do D.B. Cooper. But it still would be nice to be able to analyze it in, you know, as a forensic science major myself, who does have an interest in stuff like forensics, botched cases, cold cases, things of that nature. So who knows? Maybe I could provide some neat commentary or insight. We shall see. To all of you who requested that I watch this, this is for you guys.
Just let me know.
Let me... Oh, let me know. Okay. That was actually a fun little animation. Good job, LEMMiNO. Or let me know. Let me know. I think it is LEMMiNO. I'll have to remember that. LEMMiNO just sounded right, but let me know. Let me know. How did I never put that together? Yep.
In the afternoon of November the 24th, 1971, a middle-aged man carrying a briefcase walked into Portland International Airport and purchased a one-way ticket to Seattle, Washington.
Yep. Yep, that's right. Yep, West Coast.
The man identified himself as Dan Cooper, and along with 36 other passengers and a crew of 6, he soon boarded Northwest Airlines
that's right.
Flight 305.
That's how small the planes were back then.
Once aboard, Cooper made himself comfortable in the middle of the last row of seats on the right side of the cabin. He ordered a drink and had a smoke, because this was the 70s.
Yeah, right.
Once the flight was cleared for departure, Cooper turned around and handed an envelope to flight attendant Florence Schaffner. Inside the envelope was a note featuring a handwritten message stating he had a bomb. Schaffner reluctantly sat down beside him and glimpsed what appeared to be 8 sticks of dynamite inside his briefcase.
Oh boy. How did that get through
Cooper's
security?
demands
I mean,
were
I know
quite
this is
simple.
pre-TSA,
He
but still.
wanted $200,000 in cash and 4 parachutes. He also demanded a fuel truck to stand ready to refuel the aircraft once they landed in Seattle.
Oh.
Should they fail
Yeah,
to comply
that's
with
right.
his demands, he threatened to, quote, do the job. Once the flight was
It's
airborne,
pretty serious.
Schaffner went to inform the cockpit crew, while another flight attendant by the name of Tina Mucklow remained by Cooper's side. By using a telephone in the rear of the cabin, Mucklow acted as an intermediary between Cooper and the rest of the flight crew for the remainder of the hijacking.
Yep.
For the next hour and a half, Flight 305 maintained a holding pattern near Seattle, while local and federal authorities scrambled to procure the ransom as well as the 4 parachutes. 10,000 $20 bills were collected from a local bank, while the owner of a nearby skydiving school supplied the chutes.
Yeah.
At 5:45 p.m., more
What
than
can
2
you-
hours
what can you do
past its
besides fulfill
scheduled
the
arrival,
demands?
Flight 305 finally touched down in Seattle. By this point, it was well after sunset, and the aircraft was brought to a remote section of the tarmac. Once the flight came to a stop, both the ransom and the parachutes were handed over to Mucklow, who then brought them back aboard. In exchange, Cooper permitted 2 of the flight attendants as well as all the passengers to disembark, many of whom had not yet realized the flight had been hijacked.
Yeah. I mean,
With the
you
ransom
can't cause
paid
panic.
and only 4 crew members remaining on board, Cooper told Mucklow to inform the captain that he wanted to fly to Mexico City. They were to fly with the landing gear down, the flaps at 15 degrees and below 10,000 feet. The lights in
Yeah,
the
that's
cabin
right.
were to be switched off, and the aft stairway, which opens from the underbelly of the fuselage, was to remain extended. 2 of Cooper's demands could not be satisfied. First of all, the flight configuration he'd requested would not allow for a non-stop flight to Mexico City. As such, Cooper proposed a refueling stop in Phoenix, Yuma, or Sacramento before they all agreed on Reno, Nevada. Second of all, it was not possible to depart with the ventral staircase extended. Cooper agreed to retract the stairs on the condition that Mucklow remained by his side and taught him how to extend them once the plane was airborne. Parked for nearly 2 hours due to complications with refueling, Flight 305 was back in the air by 7:36 p.m. Less than 5 minutes after takeoff, Cooper told Mucklow to head for the cockpit and that from this point onwards, he was not to be disturbed. The last time she saw Cooper, he was standing in the middle of the aisle as if though he was preparing to jump. Mucklow joined the rest of the crew, locked the cockpit door behind her, and some 3 hours later, Flight 305 safely landed in Reno.
But
Once the flight came to a stop, the crew carefully ventured into the rear of the cabin, but there was no sign of Cooper nor the bomb.
nope.
The aft stairway had been extended mid-flight and was slightly damaged upon landing. It seemed there was only one explanation for the hijacker's
He jumped
absence. At some point between Seattle and Reno, Cooper had strapped on a parachute, walked down the stairs, and leaped into the dark of night.
Yep. Interestingly enough, when I watched this on Leverage, because again, they had a DB Cooper focused episode, and there was an individual who was like, trying to hunt for DB Cooper, who eventually was revealed to be DB Cooper himself, which, yeah, again, it's a fictitious story, but it still was interesting, because that episode proposed the idea that DB Cooper actually knew, I don't remember which flight attendant, if it was the first one or the second one, and that they basically planned the hijacking together, and then they eventually, once he made the jump, he survived, but nobody could find him because he changed his name, and that was that. Now that's definitely an interesting story. Is that what actually happened? I don't think so. It does seem highly unusual. So some of these details about the hijacking, I did know a few of them, or at least they sounded familiar, and some of the other details I actually wasn't quite as familiar with. I did know that DB Cooper did have some pretty interesting demands with, having the stairs down, having the landing gear out, and the flaps at, for the wing flaps to remain at a certain angle. I did know that stuff, because it was surmised that DB Cooper was very intelligent. If he was requesting a specific thing, like, you can only fly above or below this altitude, I mean, technically he may not have ever really known something like that, but I don't know. The guy did seem intelligent based off of his demands. And I did know that between what was it, Seattle and Reno, I forgot that it was Reno, by the way, but I knew it was somewhere along the West Coast. But between there, I did remember that it was practically the dead of night. Some of the other little details, like the names, I didn't exactly remember the names because I'm awful with names. I think it did sound familiar that most of the other passengers were unaware that there was even a hijacking in the first place. And like I said earlier, 37 passengers, is that what LEMMiNO said? I did completely forget how tiny planes were back then. Like LEMMiNO said, it's the 70s. Aviation and, plane travel was not nearly as advanced as it is today. I mean, you see a plane today, like an international flight, we're talking dozens upon dozens of people that can fit on one of those freaking planes. It's crazy. I did, however, forget about the parachute demands. Like, I knew that he wanted a parachute. I didn't realize he wanted 2 front and 2 back parachutes, though. That was something I did not realize. That was interesting to see. And, but obviously he wanted money. It's a frickin' plane hijacking. Of course, if you're going to do a hijacking on anything, like a plane, yeah, you're probably going to want money. I don't remember how much, but obviously you're going to want money. LEMMiNO did definitely do a good job sort of setting the stage for all this and having all the background information. Like, I feel like everybody who's anybody, whether they're familiar with this or not, has all the information they need before LEMMiNO can continue. So, very nice summarization, and loving all the animations and stuff that he did as well. And did I remember seeing some comments correctly that he does all this stuff by himself? Kind of like oversimplified? Does all the voice work, does all the animations, the scripts writing, all that good jazz? I'm definitely very impressed. This almost seems like professionally done. He must have some kind of education or degree in something that allows him to do this. Unless he just kind of did what I did and did trial and error, which, if he did that, holy shit, props to him. But if he has some kind of education, it wouldn't surprise me in the slightest. Whether it's filmmaking or digital media or it's something along those lines. I don't know for sure. But LEMMiNO does a great job with all the visual elements, with the audio elements, with the script writing that he's been putting together. And this is just basically the introductory session. This is very nicely put together. I may have to take some notes. The manhunt begins. Yeah.
As soon as it became clear that Cooper was no longer on board, dozens of FBI agents converged upon the aircraft, only to discover a disappointing amount of physical evidence. A black clip-on tie, 8 cigarette butts, and 2 of the 4 parachutes were all that Cooper left behind. Evidently, he'd brought the ransom and briefcase along with him. In interviews conducted on the night of the hijacking, Cooper was described by the crew and passengers as a white male with brown eyes and dark hair. He appeared to be in his mid-40s and wore a dark trench coat, a dark suit, a white shirt, a black tie, and dark shoes. Soon after boarding, he'd also donned a pair of sunglasses. Based on this description, the FBI produced the first of several composite sketches. Before they could mount a search, however, the FBI had to figure out when Cooper abandoned ship. But that was easier said than done.
Much easier said than done.
None of the 4 crew members witnessed Cooper jumping from the plane, nor did the pilots of 2 fighter jets which escorted the flight between Seattle and Reno, which is not all too surprising given it was the middle of the night. Although the flight crew did report something odd, the last communication with the hijacker occurred at approximately 8:05 p.m. when the crew used the intercom to offer assistance, which Cooper declined. Within the next 10 minutes, the crew experienced what they described as an oscillation or vibration of the aircraft. At the time, the crew suspected it might have been produced by Cooper's jump, and the subsequent recreation of the hijacking supported that conclusion. Okay, so that took care of the when, but what about the where? While
Right.
Cooper was very explicit about the flight's configuration and destination, he never specified any kind of route. In fact, Cooper grew so impatient with the slow refueling in Seattle that he dismissed the captain's request to file a flight plan and simply told him to, quote, get the show on the road. As such, the captain chose to fly along an airway known as Victor 23 without any input from Cooper. By using Victor 23 as a guide, authorities estimated the most probable location of the flight at the approximated time of the jump was about 40 kilometers north of Portland. And so, at the break of dawn,
I remember
the
something
FBI
about that
mounted
too.
an impressive search operation using helicopters, airplanes, and ground troops. The problem was, even if the estimated bailout point was accurate, Cooper's eventual landing or drop zone was far more difficult to pinpoint. The loosely defined search area covered a vast stretch of mountainous wilderness occluded by a dense forest, so it was truly like finding a needle in a haystack.
Not even
Apart from the
that.
difficult terrain, the search was further complicated by low temperatures and inclement weather, which persisted for days. Despite their best efforts, authorities never managed to find a single trace of Cooper, nor the items he'd brought along with him.
What up guys, Utterpop here. If I'm wearing a different shirt, there's a reason for that. So I think I accidentally cut off my own recording of this analysis when I was reacting and analyzing it previously. I don't know how I didn't realize that entire time, but luckily the thing about this is that it's not really a blind reaction. It's analysis and commentary from a logical scientific perspective. So it doesn't matter how many times I watch it, I can still provide some good commentary. Now, some of my initial learning some new evidence or pieces of information, that will be lost forever. Oh well. We're here to analyze. We're not necessarily here to react to this. Well, we technically are, but not for entertainment purposes. So, I think when I was finishing up Chapter 2, I believe that I was going to mention something about the wide search area that authorities initially had for D.B. Cooper when he jumped out of the plane. I may have mentioned something along the lines of, yeah, it's still a very vast and wide area, not to mention it's freaking November of all times of the year, and he has nothing more than like boots and a trench coat on. Definitely not traversal weather for mountains in the snow. So it's no surprise that authorities couldn't find anything. It's practically unmarked territory. There are no like necessarily settlements around that area. I wish I could remember exactly what I was going to mention when I specifically paused at this moment. It is what it is. I can still provide some commentary on later parts though. Am I going to be able to provide the exact commentary that I did in my first watch of this? Probably not. But I do remember a fair deal of other things that I'd talk about as I was watching this. So let's go ahead and actually continue this, not press the wrong keys, and end the reaction / analysis early. Anyways.
Having made little to no progress by early December, the FBI turned their attention to the $200,000 ransom. The money had been collected from the Seattle First National Bank, which maintained a ransom package of $250,000.
And the numbers on those bills were all sequential, because it came from a bank.
Because of this, the serial numbers of the $10,020 banknotes given to Cooper had been documented in advance. A complete list of
or
which
no,
were
no,
quickly made available
no, they
to
were
financial
documented. They weren't
institutions,
sequential, they were
government
documented though.
agencies, and the general public. The intention was to make it as difficult as possible for Cooper to spend his money.
Obviously, that's what you have to do.
Airlines and several newspapers even began to offer rewards to anyone who could find a note with a matching serial number. In spite of these efforts, no one ever did.
Oh.
That is until nearly a decade later. In early 1980, a young boy named Brian Ingram was building a campfire on a small beach in southern Washington. As he was digging into the sand, Ingram discovered 3 bundles of cash totaling $5,880. Having heard about the infamous hijacking, Ingram's parents brought the severely degraded bundles to the FBI. The notes were promptly inspected, and sure enough, the serial numbers matched those of the ransom. Once the excitement subsided, however, the money managed to raise far more questions than it answered, the most significant of which was how? How did the money end up so far away from the drop zone?
Yeah, it was like 27 kilometers away. Forgot it was that
Looking
far.
at this map, it might be tempting to think that Cooper simply dropped some of the money, which then fell into the Lewis River.
That was my first thought
The
initially
bundles
too,
could then have been carried
before LEMMiNO
further
even said it.
downstream by the Columbia River before finally being washed ashore at Tina Bar,
Except,
which is the name of the beach.
except,
Tina Mucklow, Tina Bar. Coincidence? Yeah.
yeah, just
Anyway, the problem with this idea is that the Columbia River flows in the opposite direction. This
makes
has
it
led
even more
some,
bizarre.
including members of the FBI, to re-evaluate initial drop zone assessment. For instance, if the drop zone was much further southeast, close to a river called the Washougal River, it is conceivable, albeit improbable, that the money
Still
floated all the
conceivable.
way down to Tina Bar. Alternatively, the bundles may have simply landed on the beach if the flight path was further to the west. Even so, natural explanations struggle to explain how three independent, potentially free-falling and/or free-floating bundles of cash ended up at the exact same place on
Maybe
the
as
same
DB
beach.
Cooper was
To complicate
sort of
matters,
parachuting
sediment
down.
from the riverbed was excavated and dumped onto Tina
Hold
Bar as part of a dredging operation in 1974. And according to one analysis, the money was discovered above this layer of sediment. If true, that would mean the money came to rest at Tina Bar sometime after 1974. But a re-examination of that analysis found that what was believed to be a layer of deposited sediment might actually have been a perfectly natural layer of clay. Not only that, but the sediment was clearly dumped some distance away from where the money was discovered. Furthermore, when Ingram discovered the bundles, the rubber bands which held them together were still intact. This is significant because experiments conducted in 2009 revealed that this brand of rubber bands could not withstand exposure to open air or water for more than a year.
This is actually something I don't think I mentioned in my first watch through, but now that I'm hearing LEMMiNO say it again, I am kind of thinking is if he was parachuting down and if it was further south, give or take, that he did end up parachuting down. Who knows? Maybe the bag holding the money, if he survived that is, wasn't secure, and maybe some of it came out. But then the whole thing with the rubber bands comes into play. By the way, before I get to talking on the rubber bands, that's some pretty cool information that I was unaware of. Like this whole money thing, I did not recall this kind of information. I mean, does it sound vaguely familiar? Maybe, but a lot of this is quite new to me. Because again, I didn't study the DB Cooper hijacking too much. I only know, again, little bits and pieces, but it was still really fascinating. But before I get to the rubber bands, let's talk about the geological studies that they did. I love to see LEMMiNO bring up that fact that there were some geological tests and surveys and comparison images, things of that nature, were taken into account when examining this case, which is kind of crazy because forensic science is a huge, broad spectrum, really. It's science applied to the law, but it doesn't specifically say what kind of science is applied to the law. But forensics is incredibly broad, and it's basically full of all different kinds of little subfields and specialties. There's forensic biology, which examines biological components. There is forensic anthropology, which examines old cultures and in conjunction with all kinds of other evidence and bones, which, okay, that's technically anthropology, but forensic anthropology is a subset of forensics. And then you have forensic palynology, which is basically the examination of pollen analysis and other related biological organisms as it pertains to forensics. And of course, you have things like forensic geology, which is just using geology and applying it to forensics. So in a way, if there's a forensic subfield, it's basically that science just applied to forensics, which itself is applied to the law. And geology studies and analyses in general aren't necessarily brought up too often when a lot of people go back to investigations like these, or the cold cases. It's not a topic that's often brought up, and I love that LEMMiNO brought it up because it is a very much underappreciated subset of forensics. How many times have I said forensics? I apologize. Anyways, back to the cache. So I mentioned earlier that a potential theory was that as DB Cooper was parachuting down and maybe he was going further south or west than anticipated, and the bag with the money wasn't totally secure and some of the money fell out. It's a reasonable theory, but then of course you bring the rubber bands into play. According to LEMMiNO and according to, I think, what are some evidence reports, the rubber bands were still fairly intact. The money was not very much, but the rubber bands were. And as a study, a recent study at that, I think, what do you say, 2008 or something along those lines? Or 2018? I don't know. It was definitely in the 21st century, though, decades after this had happened. But a recent study showed that those specific kinds of rubber bands, and amazing that some of those still existed, by the way, at this point, were incapable of being exposed to, I think he said water specifically, for extended periods of time. In the case of this study, about a year. So obviously, if the money was discovered in, what was it, 1980? I almost said 1780, but 1980. At most, they would have dropped there only a year prior. So they definitely couldn't have been carried away by the current of any river, at least not for a very long period of time. Maybe a few days, a few weeks, maybe even a month, but probably no more than that. So it's really interesting to think about. It's a fascinating piece of evidence that, like LEMMiNO said, raises a lot more questions than it answers.
So, unless the bundles were somehow protected from the elements, they must have become buried at Tina Bar within a year of the hijacking.
Most likely.
The most probable explanation, therefore, seems to be that Cooper or someone else deliberately buried the money. Did Cooper survive?
Only
and bury the
5,000
money
out of the
himself?
200,000? Like,
Did someone else bury the money after stumbling upon Cooper's remains? If there is an explanation which does not require human intervention, it's managed to elude investigators for decades.
it's unlikely
Suffice
there
it to say,
wasn't human
this is a
intervention.
mystery within a mystery.
It really was.
Since Ingram's discovery in 1980, both Tina Bar and the grounds around the Washougal River have been subjected to numerous searches, but to date, there's been no sign of Cooper, nor the rest of the money.
It's kind of crazy. Still a mysterious cold case even to this day. Like LEMMiNO said, mystery within a mystery. Leap of faith.
From the very beginning, it was assumed by many that Cooper did not survive his daring escape.
Understandable.
It would not make for a very thrilling conclusion to this story, but that's
True.
the thing about stories. They're usually far more exciting than reality. While there is no hard evidence for nor against Cooper's survival, the assumption that he fell to his death is not without merit. When Cooper leaped into the darkness, Flight 305 was plowing through a frigid rainstorm at roughly 170 knots, 10,000 feet above southern Washington. The wind was so violent that it ripped out a placard from the aft stairway, which was later recovered in 1978 almost directly below the estimated flight path. To say that Cooper was not dressed for the occasion would be an understatement. The ground beneath him, meanwhile, was obscured by multiple layers of clouds, which likely means that Cooper jumped without knowing his precise location. Even if he could see the ground and had a specific drop zone in mind, the parachute he selected was non-steerable, meaning he would not have been able to steer his descent towards a specific landing spot, thus precluding any potential coordination with an accomplice stationed on the ground.
Oh boy, I remember having plenty to say when I initially saw this part for the first time. I was very surprised. I was unaware of the altitude that the plane was at for the duration of its flight, and at this point in the video at least, but then I learned it was 10,000 feet. And I was also unaware of the type of parachute that D.B. Cooper ended up jumping off with. In other words, it's one of those parachutes where you can't control which direction you're going to go. It's understandable why a lot of people would think that D.B. Cooper did not survive. There's a lot going against him. You're talking high winds in a rainstorm at nighttime, and you can't control where you're going to land because of the parachute you're using. You're not going to be able to see anything. You don't know where you're going. And not just because of the winds, it's nighttime. It's practically the middle of the night. And some other people might say, you're pretty dang high up in the air. Like, you're probably not going to be able to breathe all that much. You're probably going to pass out before you even hit the ground. Unfortunately, that's where a lot of people might be wrong. Because while there is a lot of understandability and merit as to assume that D.B. Cooper did not survive his jump, that doesn't flat out mean that it's impossible. 10,000 feet is not as high as people think it is. Where I live currently is about 5,000 feet above sea level. It's almost a mile. You know, Colorado, Denver is Mile High City. It's right around a mile above sea level. And Fort Collins, only a smidge lower. Most of the state, I want to say, I think all of the entirety of the state is at least 600 or so feet above sea level. And many of our tallest mountains are 14ers, 14,000 feet tall. And you got people who will go up there and climb those and hike up there. I myself have hiked up some pretty tall mountains before. I've hiked up mountains that were 8, 9, 10, 11,000 feet. I think I've only been on a 14er once. I think just once or twice, and it was definitely a long time ago. But I'm used to it. My body has become acclimated to this very high altitude, and even when I go higher, twice the height that I'm used to, my lungs are still capable of pushing me further up, and I can still get there okay. Granted, airplane cabins are typically pressurized, so going from a very low pressure to whatever is in a plane cabin to 10,000 feet, that's a major change, and that could definitely throw somebody off. But if somebody is used to those altitudes, like either they've been in a plane multiple times or they live in high altitude normally, it's not unheard of. It's not impossible. Now, the non-self-guiding parachute does present an issue in of itself. Because I mentioned altitude and pressure and body acclimation, but something I did not mention yet are winds. If you're on a flat surface, wherever you are, and you just literally start floating up and up and up and up and up, there's a phenomenon called the wind gradient that starts to take effect. In other words, the higher up you go, the faster the wind speeds are. We're talking 10,000 feet above whatever Seattle probably is. Hold up. Actually, I'm a little bit curious. Let me see at least how far above sea level Seattle is. I thought it would be higher than that. I mean, I know it's Seattle, but geez, 175 feet elevation? Seriously? Actually, he technically was closer to around Vancouver. So let me try looking up that instead. Vancouver's not much better, but I know for a fact that DB Cooper his flight path did go over some mountains. I don't necessarily know how tall those mountains are. I mean, technically there is Mount St. Helens in Washington. I want to say it's 7,000 to 8,000 feet, something like that. Honestly, kind of a baby mountain, but I think that Mount St. Helens is kind of around that area of southwestern Washington state. And where this kind of occurred was in Washington, but not too far away from the Oregon border. There are some mountains around there, not necessarily very tall ones. The mountain range itself may only be about a few thousand feet in elevation, which is lower than a lot of the base elevations here in my state. So even 4,000 feet above your current point, if you just start floating up 4,000 feet in the sky, the wind is going to be ridiculous. On top of that, there's a rainstorm happening at nighttime. Sometimes the nighttime rainstorms will be more fierce than the daytime ones. You combine the wind gradient, the time of day that it was, the current weather situation, and of course the type of parachute that he was using, there's a good probability he didn't actually make it. But if you're experienced in planes, if you're experienced with this kind of stuff, and if you're used to elevation to an extent, it is theoretically possible. It's understandable why people would think that DB Cooper didn't survive, but it's not outright impossible. There is still a probability. No, a possibility. I'd say possibility, not probability. It's still insane. Completely.
While Cooper expressed some familiarity with parachutes, his actual competence level is up for debate. It's widely believed that Cooper demanded 2 pairs of parachutes, 2 primary and 2 reserve, to make the authorities believe that he intended to take a hostage. That is precisely what happened, as the FBI contemplated but eventually decided against sabotaging the chutes, as they did not want to risk the life of an innocent civilian. But in
Completely
their haste to
understandable.
obtain them, they unintentionally provided Cooper with a non-functional dummy chute intended for training purposes. This mishap seems to have gone unnoticed by Cooper because that dummy chute was one of the two missing from the plane. Not only that, but Cooper chose the older and technically inferior parachute out of the two primary chutes provided.
This is where it gets interesting.
So in both cases, it seems like Cooper made the worst possible choice.
However,
but there are other ways to interpret this information. For instance, it's possible that Cooper used the dummy chute not as a reserve, but as a means to secure the bag of money. In fact, that is precisely what Cooper tried to do with the functional reserve chute. First, he tried to place the money in the chute's canopy before removing some of the suspension lines and wrap them around the bag. Perhaps he used the dummy chute for a similar purpose. And Cooper's decision to use the older primary chute is not necessarily an indication of inexperience. It could also be a sign of familiarity, because the chute he left behind was a civilian luxury chute, while the one he used was a military chute. The argument is that Cooper might have been trained as, say, a paratrooper, and chose the older military chute because that's the one with which he was most familiar.
now this was definitely something I did not know about the parachutes. I did know that there was more than one set of parachutes. I didn't put two and two together that likely the reason he asked for them was that he intended to jump on his own, but he wanted to make other people think that he was also taking a hostage, which was pretty smart on D.B. Cooper's part. Not a lot of people would think about that, even today. And not the hostage part, but trying to ensure your own safety by asking for two sets of parachutes, implying that you might be taking a hostage with you, which would push authorities not to provide any bad or dummy chutes, even though this was an accidentally. And LEMMiNO also points out something very interesting that not only did I not know, but I hadn't fully considered, was that of the two primary chutes available, obviously, as LEMMiNO said, there's the civilian chute and a military parachute. And as soon as he brought that up, I didn't even consider if D.B. Cooper had any kind of military-related background. But that is really interesting to know about. If he did take the military parachute simply because he did have more familiarity, because he did have a military background, the parachute, the information about the parachute is definitely supporting evidence. No question about it. I haven't done much research on this particular hijacking, but it's very interesting information that I would have had to come across and not specifically look for. I didn't even really know that there were a whole lot of differences between certain kinds of parachutes. But there is definitely evidence supporting the fact that not only was he very intelligent, and he did think things through, he wasn't a perfect planner, obviously, but he did think things through, and that he could have had some kind of military or governmental background. There's definitely a lot of supporting evidence for both of those. But again, we may never know.
And there is at least one other reason to suspect that Cooper had a military background. While the flight was in a holding pattern near Seattle, Cooper mentioned that the McCord Air Force Base was only 20 minutes away from the Seattle-Tacoma
How would you
airport.
know that specific
At the
information?
time, that was an accurate assessment and might suggest a military background. Apart from the potential military
Supporting
connections,
evidence.
Cooper may even have had links to the Central Intelligence Agency. You see, the type of aircraft which Cooper chose to hijack, a Boeing 727, was also used by the CIA to covertly drop agents and supplies during the Vietnam War, a task for which the Boeing 727 was uniquely qualified due to its distinctive aft stairway. So it's fairly safe to assume that Cooper chose to hijack a Boeing 727 specifically because it provided a relatively safe means of escape. Whether he learned of this from the CIA or came to that
It's
conclusion
more likely that he was
independently
military than
is another
CIA,
question.
but it's still
However,
interesting.
the fact that Cooper chose to hijack a flight operated by Northwest Airlines was apparently random chance. When Tina Mucklow asked Cooper about his motives, he responded, "It's not because I have a grudge towards your airline, it's just because I have a grudge." He further clarified that Flight 305 just happened to be in the right place at the right time. Even so, it's clear that Cooper came prepared. He seemed to know a great deal about aircraft and aviation. He appeared to be familiar with the local terrain. He maintained a low profile to avoid a panic. He covered his eyes with a pair of glasses to conceal his identity. He left very little evidence behind, and he demanded 4 parachutes to force the assumption that he was taking a hostage.
A lot of evidence supporting how intelligent he probably was.
He was even cunning enough to reclaim the note which he'd initially given to Florence Schaffner. Apart from the name he wrote on his plane ticket, there are no other samples of Cooper's handwriting. But for all his planning and cunning, it seems Cooper did not give enough thought to his eventual escape. Not only did he fail to specify a route, but he was forced to make a last-minute destination change.
And if he did have a military background, that is interesting that he didn't
more appropriate
consider
parachuting equipment like a pair of boots, a helmet, or jumpsuit. He could even have specified the ransom to be delivered in larger denominations to make it lighter and less cumbersome to carry. Presuming he did survive the fall and made it safely to the ground, he may then have had to make his way through a dense, partially snow-covered forest in nothing but loafers and a trench coat in late November. I get the distinct impression that Cooper's escape was much more of a leap of faith than a carefully executed jump.
Sure. I think in some ways it was a little bit of a leap of faith. He was familiar with a lot of the technical aspects of the planning, but in terms of common sense, I'm not entirely sure that he was. Because again, there is a lot of evidence supporting the fact that he was very intelligent and he did have a lot of knowledge. And him having a grudge, him wanting some kind of form of revenge, does suggest that he may not have been thinking clearly when trying to plan this all out. He probably had the technical stuff down from knowing about parachutes, if he had a military background especially, knowing about the terrain, about planes and aircrafts and aviation, things like that. But to not specify what kinds of bills so that it could potentially make something lighter to heft around, he didn't have any other kinds of clothing to cover him in the snowy mountains of November West Coast mountains. Literally just boots, pants, a trench coat, and he didn't consider the fact that from, what was it, Tacoma, I think it was, to Mexico City, you can't do that one way. You have to stop somewhere. And that he there were a lot of common sense things that he didn't specify that most people wouldn't think about. If this was carefully planned, he probably should have thought about it. But his judgment may have been a little bit impaired. So while he did have a lot of technical and book knowledge, his street smarts may have been a little bit and his judgment may have been a little bit clouded by whatever grudge or whatever revenge he was after.
On the other hand, authorities never received a missing persons report matching the description of Cooper in the wake of the hijacking. This might suggest that Cooper did survive and that he swiftly and quietly resumed his normal routine.
Unless he was a lone
Furthermore,
wolf.
other hijackers have performed similar stunts, and many of them did survive, even if they were quickly apprehended. Finally, the simplest explanation for how 3 bundles of cash ended up at Tina Bar is human intervention. At the end of the day, most of this is based on nothing but supposition. Without any concrete evidence of Cooper's demise, it leaves the door wide open to the far more exciting proposition that he did, in fact, survive.
Is this the suspects? Yep.
By the time the press got wind of the hijacking, the FBI had already begun to investigate a few potential suspects. Among them was a man in Portland with initials DB and surname Cooper. This Cooper was quickly eliminated as a suspect, but due to a mix-up by the press, the name Dan Cooper was confused for DB Cooper, and the rest is history.
Yeah, quick little interjection here, because that is amusing and that is something that I was aware of. But the thing is, when people talk about the Dan Cooper hijacking, most people either don't know or it doesn't register. But people are familiar enough with the DB Cooper hijack, and that's what I've been constantly saying too. Calling Dan DB Cooper and calling it the D.B. Cooper hijacking because that's what people know. That's just common knowledge. It's more of a factoid than anything else. But it's what people most easily recognize, even though there are those of us who know that that's technically incorrect. Sorry, random little interjection, but I thought it was a little amusing.
Dan Cooper was confused for D.B. Cooper, and the rest is history. While Dan Cooper is most likely a pseudonym, there is a comic book series of the same name. The comic is written in French and centers around a Canadian pilot named Dan Cooper. While the comic was not translated into English nor sold in the United States before 1971, it was available in Canada, which has a large French-speaking population. Given that American and Canadian accents can be difficult to distinguish, it's possible that Cooper, who was described as having no discernible accent, was a bilingual Canadian. This might even be supported by something that Cooper might have said. You see, when the captain relayed Cooper's demands to air traffic control, he used the phrase negotiable American currency. It seems doubtful that an American citizen would specify American currency, so perhaps Cooper was not American. The problem is, we don't know if this is a direct quote from Cooper or paraphrasing by the captain. For instance, notes taken by the crew during the hijacking merely contain the phrase negotiable currency, while testimonies provided by the crew after the hijacking include phrases like $200,000 in cash and circulated US currency. So Cooper might have been Canadian, and he might have taken his name from the Dan Cooper comics, just as he might have been American and might have taken his name from something or someone else.
And think about this too. This is actually something I didn't think about until right now, but not all Americans, especially with military backgrounds, not all of them are stationed in strictly American ports or cities. There are other locations. So you never know. He could have been in Canada for a short period of time, and that's probably how he could have come across the Dan Cooper comic. Or again, like LEMMiNO said, he could just be a bilingual, or not even necessarily a bilingual, but a multinational individual who has just lived in Canada and the US. He may not have necessarily even spoken French. It is an interesting coincidence, though, with the comic, so he definitely could have taken his name from there, which, if he did, could imply that he did know some French, which supports the multilingual theory. That's kind of the only piece of evidence really there. And then there's the varied testimonies about how he demanded the cash, whether it was in dollars, negotiable American currency, or just negotiable currency. There are too many variations and factors to know for sure, as is the case with a lot of the pieces of evidence for this story. There's either not enough evidence to strongly support a theory, or there's evidence but it raises more questions than it answers.
Just as he might have been American and might have taken his name from something or someone else. Nearly half a century has gone by since the hijacking took place, and in that time, thousands of suspects have been questioned and investigated. It would obviously be impossible to cover all of them here, but let's take a look at some of the people that at some point or another have been suspected of being D.B. Cooper.
I think he provides like 5 or 6, and they're all pretty interesting in their own way.
Robert Rackstraw first became a suspect in 1978, and on the surface, he seems like a solid candidate. He was a decorated Army paratrooper and helicopter pilot. He had experience with explosives. He had an extensive criminal record. He had an uncle named John Cooper who was an avid skydiver. He was expelled from the army only months before the hijacking, which might suggest a motive. After all, the hijacker did say he had a grudge. When confronted by journalists and private investigators, Rackstraw would neither confirm nor outright deny that he was D.B. Cooper. Instead, he'd say things like, "I could have been," or "I would not discount myself." On the other hand, Rackstraw had light-colored eyes, which Cooper did not. More significantly, Rackstraw was only 28 years of age at the time of the hijacking. This is well outside the range of ages reported by the crew and passengers, most of whom believe Cooper was in his mid-40s.
Although if multiple people believed he was in his 40s, then there's a pretty good chance.
Kenneth Christensen first became a suspect in 2003 when his brother noticed certain parallels between him and Cooper. Christensen had briefly served as a paratrooper in World War II, and since 1953 he'd worked for Northwest Airlines as both a mechanic and a flight attendant. He was 45 years old at the time of the hijacking. He was left-handed, which Cooper might have been. For instance, Cooper used his left hand to interact with his briefcase, and the clip-on tie he left on board was affixed with a tie clasp.
The strongest evidence for if he was a lefty.
Shortly before he died in 1994, Christensen had supposedly told his brother, "There is something you should know, but I cannot tell you." After his passing, his family discovered over $200,000 in his bank accounts. To top it all off, Florence Schaffner stated that photographs of Christensen bore a strong resemblance to Cooper. On the other hand, Christensen did not match the physical description of Cooper. He was both shorter and lighter. While Schaffner did see a strong resemblance, she remarked that Cooper had more hair, and that is supported by the composite sketches. And there was nothing suspicious about the large sums of money which he'd simply earned by selling land. Richard McCoy first became a suspect in 1972 when he hijacked a Boeing 727 and escaped via the aft stairway, much like D.B. Cooper. Because of the significant overlap between the two hijackings, some believe they must have been committed by the same person. McCoy used a fake name, he used a fake hand grenade to threaten the crew, he used handwritten notes to issue his demands. Both McCoy and Cooper used the phrase "no funny stuff" as a warning to the crew. McCoy demanded $500,000 in cash and 4 parachutes. McCoy also bailed out the back of the plane once they passed over his hometown in the state of Utah. Apart from the similar modus operandi, McCoy had also served in the Vietnam War as a demolitions expert and a helicopter pilot. McCoy did actually survive the fall and managed to evade authorities for 2 full days before he was apprehended and sentenced to 45 years in prison. Before his death in 1974, McCoy refused to confirm or deny that he was D.B. Cooper. On the other hand, McCoy was an avid recreational skydiver and even came prepared with a skydiving helmet and jumpsuit. He gave very specific instructions about the flight path. In addition to the fake hand grenade, McCoy also used an unloaded handgun to threaten the crew. He failed to retrieve one of the notes he'd given to a flight attendant. He was only 29 years of age at the time of the hijacking, and all 3 flight attendants were quite certain that McCoy was not Cooper. While there are meaningful parallels between these 2 cases, McCoy might simply have been a copycat who'd read about D.B. Cooper in the news.
Entirely possible, yes.
Dwayne Webber first became a suspect in 1995 when, shortly before his death, he supposedly told his wife, "I've got a secret to tell you. I am Dan Cooper." Following his deathbed confession, Webber's widow recalled a number of fascinating details. She claims to have found a bank bag resembling the one used in the hijacking. She claims Webber had sustained a knee injury after jumping out of a plane. Webber supposedly had a nightmare about leaving his fingerprints on the aft stairs. And a year before the money was discovered at Tina Bar, Webber had allegedly paid a quick visit to the same location. In addition, Webber was a World War II veteran. He had an extensive criminal record, he'd matched the physical description, and he was 47 years old in 1971. On the other hand, Webber's fingerprints did not match any of the prints collected from Flight 305. Although, to be fair, there's no way to know if any of those prints actually belong to Cooper.
True, but
furthermore,
fingerprints
Webber's
are damning
DNA
pieces
did
of
not
evidence.
match a DNA sample collected from the tie clasp. But once again, there's no way to know if the DNA on the tie clasp actually came from the hijacker.
The fingerprints I
and
can
not
understand,
else.
but the DNA is
What's
most
so
likely to be
frustrating
Cooper's.
is that the FBI likely had a much better source of DNA at one point. If you recall, 8 cigarette butts were collected from the scene, and there's a good chance they were all suffused with Cooper's DNA. The problem is, that evidence was lost at some point, and has not turned up since.
Up? Somebody fucked up, and that bothers me that somebody did. That's just
Smith
infuriating.
first became a suspect in 2018. Smith served in the Navy during World War II and likely had some experience with parachuting. He was 43 years old at the time of the hijacking. He had dark brown eyes. He matched the physical description. He shared a certain likeness with the composite sketches, especially this speculative sketch of an older D.B. Cooper. A student named Ira Daniel Cooper, who was killed in World War II, attended the same high school as Smith. Smith worked as a yardmaster for a railroad company for most of his life, but in 1970 the company filed for bankruptcy. As a consequence, Smith lost his pension, which might suggest a motive. He could, for
Very
instance,
possible.
have developed a grudge towards the airline industry for their role in bringing about the downfall of the rail transportation industry.
True.
It's further speculated that Smith could have used his knowledge of railroad networks to hop on a train and escape undetected. On the other hand, Smith spent his entire life in the northeastern United States, given that the hijacking occurred on the other side of the
big
country
piece of evidence to point
and was
out.
committed by someone who at least appeared to be familiar with the local terrain. Smith is not the most ideal candidate. However, the fact that Smith worked as a yardmaster is interesting. You see, the tie that Cooper left behind was recently examined using an electron microscope, which uncovered various metallic particles. Some of these particles, especially pure titanium, were quite rare in 1971. This might suggest that Cooper worked as a manager at some sort of chemical or metallurgical facility, or possibly a rail yard.
Very interesting, and those are only
If
some
nothing
of the
else,
cases.
I hope this limited
Some of the
selection
suspects.
of suspects illustrates just how difficult it is to be certain when you have so little evidence to work with. These 5 individuals look nothing alike, yet any one of them could be D.B. Cooper. Was Cooper really in his mid-40s, or did he simply look old for his age?
Yeah, exactly.
Did Cooper really serve in the military? Which one of these sketches most closely resemble Cooper? In 2016, the FBI had to admit defeat and officially close down the case.
Crazy.
Unless someone
The
stumbles
FBI
upon Cooper's
would
remains
just
or
the
manages
FBI
to
of all
track down the rest of
organizations
the money,
just gave up.
it seems there is little hope of resolution. Did Cooper survive? I have no idea. But as long as that possibility cannot be dismissed, the legend of D.B. Cooper will no doubt persist.
Let's go ahead and let the patrons play out. They should continue to get shoutouts. Because, yeah. LEMMiNO definitely does a lot of his research. No doubt. No doubt he does a lot of his research for all kinds of images and information. And I have to commend him for sure. It's very impressive, without a doubt. Good, I just checked and my computer is still recording. Hallelujah! So I can actually finish out my thoughts and not have to worry about needing to record this again. The fact that there were so many suspects, and LEMMiNO only talked about 5 of them, and there's pros and cons to each theory. There's evidence that supports, oh, it could be this person, but then there's other pieces of evidence that refutes it, and it's always different pieces of evidence. What is my take on Dan Cooper, and if he survived or not? I think it kind of depends. The biggest factor for me is if he had a military background. If he had a military background or some kind of governmental background in which he was accustomed to being a paratrooper or being in planes, something along those lines, that skyrockets the chance that he probably could have survived. If he didn't have a military background, I think it's a hit or miss. There are so many factors going against him, but he definitely took a lot into consideration. I think he definitely was intelligent, especially on a lot of the technical know-how. Street smarts, maybe a little less so, which in of itself could further support a military background, because there are plenty of individuals who are in the military, even especially for extended periods of time, where they suddenly come home and they may not act the same as they used to, sometimes can't acclimate better to society as, average citizens do. PTSD, it's entirely possible, especially if the guy was in his 40s. Which brings up another point, is maybe multiple witnesses placed him as being some kind of 40-year-old, but that's all based on perspective. We really don't know for sure. He could have been in his 30s and just looked older. He could have been in his 50s or 60s. It's really hard to say for sure. There isn't really a lot of contradictory evidence, but there's just so many pieces of evidence scattered around, and not a lot of concrete stuff either. But little bits and pieces of evidence that are scattered around, pointing to all different kinds of theories, sometimes with pieces of evidence supporting multiple theories, and some pieces of evidence going into their own theories that don't even make sense or don't even exist. There are too many factors in play and not enough concrete evidence. If you think about it, the only concrete evidence that we have is the money. I wouldn't say that the rest is speculative, per se, but the rest is circumstantial and hearsay and guesswork at best. I think there is a decent chance that he did survive. Is he alive today? I don't think so. Whether he survived or not, I don't think he's alive at this point. Whether he survived at the time of the hijacking, couldn't say for sure. But LEMMiNO is right. Without concrete evidence, it's up in the air. We don't know for sure. We can't conclusively do anything. The FBI couldn't conclusively do anything. They gave up. They're like, without any concrete proof, we're at a loss. And I don't blame them. This would be a tough nut to crack for most people. Whether they were into forensics or not, whether they were rookies or experts, this is a hard one to crack. And even the composite sketches don't really look a whole lot alike. And the 5 suspects that LEMMiNO mentioned, just 5 of them out of the dozens, didn't really look a lot like each other, and maybe some had some resemblance to a sketch or two. But there's too much variation. There are too many factors in play. That's my take. I commend LEMMiNO for making this. And I can tell that by this point in time, because I think this particular video was released like 2 or 3 years after the Dyatlov Pass Case, I can tell that he's improved his craft a lot. And I believe I heard something about him doing all this content on his own. Bigger commendation to him. Absolutely. It kind of reminds me of Oversimplified, but Oversimplified usually is making his own animations and is talking much bigger and general events. But these are specific little pinpricks in history. And LEMMiNO has done a great job with the research, with the animations, with the video and audio effects. He's done very well. I am so glad to people who requested that I watch this. This was definitely a very great and a very interesting watch. I did learn a lot of very interesting pieces of evidence, and I hope I did not disappoint in my analysis. May have to watch some more of LEMMiNO's content and analyze it. It is very interesting. I don't know if LEMMiNO will ever see this, but I hope he appreciates how much I am commending him, I am praising him for his research and for all this work that he puts into his videos. It makes me wish I could do the same for my videos, but given my content and given how many other projects I have to juggle, I don't really think that's possible. It's a fun thought though, very fun thought. So I'm gonna go ahead, I'm gonna end it there. Thank you all for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed this reaction review analysis, whatever you like to call it. And as usual, until the next video guys, check you laters.